For a while now, I've been wanting to do an episode where I take Greek gods and redesign them into a modern day superhero slash comic book slash video game kind of style. Partially, I've been wanting to work with Greek gods because a few months ago, Hades became one of my favorite video games of all time, and maybe a bit because when I'm working on these videos, sometimes I just have the musical Hades Town going on loop. But regardless of the reason, I finally stopped putting off this episode and wrote a story to go along with it about the Greek gods coming back to life in modern day, and the story is actually pretty heavily inspired by Mortal Kombat. But it'll make more sense why that's the case once we get into it, so why don't we just get into it? Hit like, if you want. Subscribe, if you feel like. But either way, enjoy the show. Centuries ago, the world was ruled over by gods, whose power was fueled by the prayers of those they lorded over. But as time went on, people lost faith that these gods truly had their best intentions at heart, and slowly the once proud deities lost all their powers, until they were so forgotten that they could no longer remain conscious. Some gods fought this as long as they could, but some, like Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare, believed humanity no longer needed the gods and accepted her end willingly. The gods all slipped into a multi-millennia slumber, eventually fading into myth. That is, until the cult of Diorum rose. The cult believed what nobody else did, that the gods had indeed been real, and that the world had been better off when they watched over humanity. Members of the cult would spend hours every day praying to the gods in temples to try and replenish their strength and bring them back to the world. For a decade, the cult grew and grew until finally, at 10,000 members strong, their prayers were finally answered. There was just enough godly energy spurred from their beliefs that the gods could reawaken. Each god awoke with a different outlook on the world that they once ruled, what it had become in the time they'd slumbered. All thought they had the answer for how to fix the earth and reclaim control, but the problem was, with such a small group granting them the prayers they needed to reawaken, none of the gods could regain their full strength. That is, unless only one god remained to pray to. See, at the first god's regathering, it was pointed out by Hades that if the full force of the cult's prayers were focused on one single god, that deity would return to their full might. At first, they all tried to stay diplomatic and come up with a solution to their problem together. But, as is apparent from the myths of old, the gods are petty and easily enraged beings. It took a first strike from Ares, who was livid by how long it had been since a large-scale war had been fought on Earth. He saw dozens of global issues that he believed would never be solved with words, and could only be solved once a victor of a great war could be revealed to determine how the world would progress. Ares first struck out against his father, Zeus, the most naturally powerful of the gods. Athena, sister of Ares and daughter of Zeus, leapt in to protect him, but quickly realized that Zeus had every intention of killing her and Ares and every other god so he could be the one true ruler. An all-out brawl began that ended with many of the gods fleeing to prepare themselves for a war to decide who would be the final god. Demeter wasn't a goddess who often took up arms for combat, but with what humanity had done to her world, she felt she had to regain her full might to cleanse humanity of its filthy habits. See, she was the goddess of agriculture, fertility, and the harvest. She saw the green of her world slowly dying, shrouded in smogs. She saw crops being genetically altered and animals sealed into sunless confinement for eventual consumption, which she considered blasphemous betrayals of the proper order of the harvest. She prepared herself for battle, remaining close to the forested areas of the world, where her currently weakened powers could thrive. But even before she could think about trying to save the Earth, she had some unfinished business with a particularly vile deity, Hades. Before the gods had fallen into their slumber, Hades had kidnapped Demeter's daughter, Persephone, and trapped her away in the underworld, where she had since surely died. Demeter had searched for her daughter, but never found her. Now that the gods were openly at war with one another, there was nothing stopping her from slaying the god of the dead. On her search for him, Athena found Demeter and proposed a temporary alliance. They had their own goals in mind, but they also agreed that they both had no intention of allowing a treacherous or merciless god like Hades or Ares to rise to power. Plus, they both knew they'd likely need an ally in defeating Zeus. Together, the two goddesses hunted down Hades near the entrance of the underworld, Pluto's Gate in modern-day Turkey. Hades was distraught to find even the peaceful realms of his once great underworld, such as Elysium, were now barren and grey. He'd once felt cheated for having to rule over the underworld while his siblings watched over the earth, but now he took pride in his world being superior to that of the land above. So he was furious when he found that people who died for the last millenniums while he'd been slumbering hadn't gone to the underworld. Hades didn't know where they'd gone, but not to his realm. He swore to send plagues upon the earth to replenish his precious underworld. But this vow only further fueled Demeter and Athena's desire to slay the god of the dead. But it wouldn't be an easy task. Hades was powerful in his own right, but in visiting the underworld, he'd also reclaimed his Helm of Darkness, a piece of armor that turned the wearer invisible. Unable to see the vile god, he struck them with his bident spear. Athena's battle skills helped her immensely and protected her, but Demeter was herded towards the gateway. Hades managed to pull her into the underworld, and there she had no power. With all the plant life long dead, it took little for him to end her. By the time Athena leapt in to help, Demeter had been run through with his bident. Hades' last words to her were, "I'll bury you next to your daughter." Athena sprung into action against Hades, enraged by the death of her ally, and even on his homelands, she was far more than he could handle. With Demeter's blood on his bident and armor, Athena could now follow his movements, and while he was strong, his battle skills were little compared to that of Athena's wisdom of warfare. She fought with a spear and her mighty Aegis, a nearly unbreakable shield with which she deflected every blow Hades sent her way. Eventually, Athena even managed to lure Hades back towards the gateway. She stabbed through his shoulder and hurled him back through to Earth, and there, the fight didn't last much longer. She soon had the dark god on his knees and granted him the mercy of final words. He simply laughed and told her that even if she struck him down, it was too late. His legacy would live on. She asked him what he meant, but before she got an answer, he pushed his body into her spear and impaled himself, ending his own life. She knew she'd have to figure out what he meant eventually, but she didn't have the time. With gods across the world dying in battle with one another, the remaining ones grew stronger and stronger. And while this meant Athena regained strength, it was nothing compared to how much stronger Zeus must have been getting, and there were signs of that worldwide. A mighty storm was stirring over Greece, but it was slowly spreading across the earth. She knew she wasn't likely to find another ally like Demeter, so Athena took Hades' helmet and headed for Mount Olympus, knowing Zeus would have been far too prideful to flee his home once the fighting had begun. Less than a week later, she was making her way up the treacherous cliffs, along the way finding some scattered bodies of their broken pantheon. But as she approached the summit, the huffing of heavy feet came from behind her. She turned to see her brother Ares, clad in an arsenal of modern weaponry. He was eager to face off against his sister, and he deemed her one of the few gods with enough knowledge of warfare to give him a good fight. But he also assumed it wouldn't be a long fight. He began by firing wrist-mounted projectiles far beyond anything they'd had in ancient times. A few bullets pierced and grazed Athena, but for the most part she managed to protect herself with her shield as she found cover behind some rocks. He quickly cycled his weapon's bullets, but then pulled a rocket launcher from his back and fired it at her hiding spot. The explosion sent her flying across the mountain. Her face and arms were carved by rocks, but she was still ready to fight. Next, Ares pulled a ring from a small round object and hurled it at her, but she had no intention of waiting to see what it did. She batted it back at him with her spear, and he quickly leapt aside as it exploded in the air near him. Athena was shocked by how such a small object had caused such a large eruption. Ares had more of the explosives on him, but he was ready to fight up close. He pulled a monstrous blade from his back and lurched forth. While Athena was banged up, this was a fight she could handle. She held her ground and let Ares approach. He swung his blade with a rage that seemed to have been building the whole while the gods had slumbered. His sword against her shield bellowed sounds beyond that of the raging thunder above. Athena focused on blocking, and it only enraged Ares more and more. His movements got angrier and sloppier. He swung and swung with mighty blows, but all Athena needed was one opening, and eventually he did slip, and she got her shot. Athena thrust her spear straight through Ares' heart. Without another word or another move, his body went limp. The god of war was dead, but the war of the gods wasn't yet finished. Zeus's storm covered nearly half the world as his power was approaching its full might. And as he got stronger, his ambitions grew. He no longer wanted to only have the full prayers of the cult of Dioram, he wanted to regain the prayers of all mortals, and any who refused to praise him would have their homes decimated in an endless hurricane. But Athena wasn't about to let that happen. She climbed her way to the peak of Olympus to find her father. She told him the day of the gods had passed. As the patron goddess of heroic endeavors, she believed there was enough heroic mortals alive to bring the world to a place of true peace. She thought the gods were self-righteous and didn't deserve the powers they had. But Zeus scoffed at her hypocritic insults. He reminded her that she was no better than her fellow deities. She'd once turned a mortal into a snake-haired monster simply for claiming she was more beautiful than Athena. But to his surprise, Athena admitted he was right. In her final days before the long sleep, Athena had come to terms with the fact that besides her godly powers, she was no better than any mortal. But she was at least better for the world than Zeus. With that, the gods were done talking, but as Zeus leapt into battle, Athena vanished. She finally donned the Helm of Darkness. She'd known she didn't need it to defeat her brother, but her own arrogance wasn't extensive enough to keep her from using it against a foe like Zeus. But the edge it gave her was only temporary. She managed to get in close for a few quick strikes of her spear against Zeus's ankles and elbows, but with the torrential storm around them, he was quickly able to spot her by the rain pinging off her armor. He formed a bolt of lightning and hurled it at her, knocking the helmet from her head. It disappeared into the storm. Zeus spawned a mighty, laborious axe forged from pure lightning and swung it at his daughter. It struck her shield with enough force to knock her backwards. He pushed towards her and struck again and again. The shield dented, then cracked. Soon it would be useless, so she hurled it into Zeus's face and used the brief distraction to regroup. She couldn't use the same strategy she had on her brother, but luckily she had a failsafe in case things turned for the worse. Zeus swung at her again and again, and she did all she could to deflect his blows. He wasn't growing enraged as her brother had, he was simply becoming more confident of his impending victory with every strike. Athena was tiring. She feared the worst was approaching. Zeus started getting blows against her, slicing her leg, then her side, then even getting a blow into her neck. In a final thrust of her spear, she leapt forward and drove it through his thigh, the only body part he'd left open to attack. It clearly hurt, but now her weapon was stuck, and she was close enough to grab by the throat. Athena's vision was fading in and out, with the sparking eyes of Zeus glaring at her. Like his daughter had done, Zeus gave his foe the courtesy of final words, but Athena smirked and raised her hand, on which were 4 dangling rings. Her final words were, "Goodbye, father." The explosives Athena had taken off her brother erupted in a massive explosion, wiping both Athena and Zeus from the face of the earth. The storm above faded, and with that, the reign of the gods was truly over, at least for now. You see, many of the gods, in their brief time awakened, had realized they needed assurance their legacies could carry on. Hades, Ares, even Zeus had realized this. And while they'd all met their end, many could now live on through the children that would soon be welcomed into the world. Well, I'm glad I stopped putting off this episode and finally made it, because it was pretty fun to make. I really liked writing the story and doing the artwork. Curious to see how people respond to this one. I left it open-ended so I could do more stories in this world. The next most obvious choice would be to do a demigods episode with a modern-day Hercules or Perseus, Achilles, characters like that. Maybe have them fighting or teaming up. Who knows? It'll depend how well this video does. But anyway, if you like my superhero kinds of designs and you're new to the channel, I got tons of different superhero kinds of videos. I recently added another installment to my weird Marvel and DC Fusions episodes. I've got a whole bunch of those. And then I also do episodes where I turn superheroes into other things like dragons and dinosaurs and stuff. Go poking around. If you like this, you'll probably like a lot of my other videos. But anyway, everybody, that's all for today. I'm Christian Pearson. This has been PopCross Studios, home of the nerdiest art videos on YouTube. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. Another reminder that the shirt I'm wearing in this episode is up on my Teespring store now, linked below this video. But besides that, I'll see you all in the next one. Goodbye, everyone.